thevoicebeforethevoid.net. Every year has its dark stain. From A Century of Dishonor, a sketch of the United States government's dealings with some of the Indian tribes. By Helen Hunt Jackson. Read by The Voice Before the Void. There are within the limits of the United States between 250 and 300,000 Indians, exclusive of those in Alaska. The names of the different tribes and bands, as entered in the statistical tables of the Indian Office reports, number nearly 300. There is not, among these 300 bands of Indians, one which has not suffered cruelly at the hands either of the government or of white settlers. The poorer, the more insignificant, the more helpless the band, the more certain the cruelty and outrage to which they have been subjected. This is especially true of the bands on the Pacific Slope. These Indians found themselves of a sudden surrounded by and caught up in the great influx of gold-seeking settlers, as helpless creatures on a shore are caught up in a tidal wave. There was not time for the government to make treaties, not even time for communities to make laws. The tales of the wrongs, the oppressions, the murders of the Pacific Slope Indians would be a volume by itself, and is too monstrous to be believed. It makes little difference, however, where one opens the record of the history of the Indians. Every page and every year has its dark stain. The story of one tribe is the story of all, varied only by differences of time and place. But neither time nor place makes any difference in the main facts. Colorado is as greedy and unjust in 1880 as was Georgia in 1830, and Ohio in 1795. And the United States government breaks promises now as deftly as then, and with an added ingenuity from long practice. One of its strongest supports in doing so is the widespread sentiment among the people of dislike to the Indian, of impatience with his presence as a, quote, barrier to civilization, unquote, and distrust of his presence as a possible danger. The old tales of the frontier life, with its horrors of Indian warfare, have gradually, by 2 or 3 generations telling, produced in the average mind something like an hereditary instinct of unquestioning and unreasoning aversion, which it is almost impossible to dislodge or soften. There are hundreds of pages of unimpeachable testimony on the side of the Indian, but it goes for nothing, is set down as sentimentalism or partisanship, tossed aside and forgotten. President after president has appointed commission after commission to inquire into and report upon Indian affairs, and to make suggestions as to the best methods of managing those affairs. The reports are filled with eloquent statements of wrongs done to the Indians, of perfidies on the part of the government. They counsel, as earnestly as words can, a trial of the simple and unperplexing expedients of telling truth, keeping promises, making fair bargains, dealing justly in all ways and all things. These reports are bound up with the government's annual reports, and that is the end of them. It would probably be no exaggeration to say that not one American citizen out of 10,000 ever sees them or knows that they exist. And yet any one of them, circulated throughout the country, read by the correct thinking, correct feeling men and women of this land, would be of itself a, quote, campaign document, unquote, that would initiate a revolution which would not subside until the Indians' wrongs were, so far as is now left possible, righted. In 1869, President Grant appointed a commission of 9 men, representing the influence and philanthropy of 6 leading states, to visit the different Indian reservations and to, quote, examine all matters appertaining to Indian affairs, unquote. In the report of this commission are such paragraphs as the following. Quote, to assert that the Indian will not work is as true as it would be to say that the white man will not work. Why should the Indian be expected to plant corn, fence lands, build houses, or do anything but get food from day to day, when experience has taught him that the product of his labor will be seized by the white man tomorrow? The most industrious white man would become a drone under similar circumstances. Nevertheless, many of the Indians are already at work. The history of the government connections with the Indians is a shameful record of broken treaties and unfulfilled promises. The history of the border white man's connection with the Indians is a sickening record of murder, outrage, robbery, and wrongs committed by the former as the rule, and occasional savage outbreaks and unspeakably barbarous deeds of retaliation by the latter as the exception. The testimony of some of the highest military officers of the United States is on record to the effect that, in our Indian wars, almost without exception, the first aggressions have been made by the white man, and the assertion is supported by every civilian of reputation who has studied the subject. In addition to the class of robbers and outlaws who find impunity in their nefarious pursuits on the frontiers, there is a large class of professedly reputable men who use every means in their power to bring on Indian wars for the sake of the profit to be realized from the presence of troops and the expenditure of government funds in their midst. They proclaim death to the Indians at all times, in words and publications, making no distinction between the innocent and the guilty. They irate the lowest class of men to the perpetuation of the darkest deeds against their victims, and as judges and jurymen shield them from the justice due to their crimes. Every crime committed by a white man against an Indian is concealed or palliated. Every offense committed by an Indian against a white man is borne on the wings of the post or the telegraph to the remotest corner of the land, clothed with all the horrors which the reality or imagination can throw around it. Against such influences as these, the people of the United States need to be warned. Unquote. There is a disposition in a certain class of minds to be impatient with any protestation against wrong, which is unaccompanied or unprepared with a quick and exact scheme of remedy. This is illogical. When pioneers in a new country find a tract of poisonous and swampy wilderness to be reclaimed, they do not withhold their hands from fire and axe till they see clearly which way roads should run, where good water will spring, and what crops will best grow on the redeemed land. They first clear the swamp. So, with this poisonous and baffling part of the domain of our national affairs, let us first clear the swamp. However great perplexity and difficulty there may be in the details of any and every plan possible for doing at this late date anything like justice to the Indian, However hard it may be for good statesmen and good men to agree upon the things that ought to be done, there certainly is, or ought to be, no perplexity whatever, no difficulty whatever, in agreeing upon certain things that ought not to be done, and which must cease to be done before the first steps can be taken toward righting the wrongs, curing the ills, and wiping out the disgrace to us of the present condition of our Indians. Cheating, robbing, breaking promises, these three are clearly things which must cease to be done. One more thing also, and that is the refusal of the protection of the law to the Indians' rights of property, quote, of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, unquote.